Paraguay is growing. Obviously, a lot of people come here for taxes. You can also participate in a growing economy. It's, I think, the second or third fastest growing country in South America. It's amazing.
So how does it compare to your initial expectations?
You step out of the hotel and you want to take a walk. As Germans, we love walking. In Asuncion, the pavement doesn't even work. There are holes in the pavement stops. And I was a bit depressed the first days and I thought, ooh, that's going to be a problem. We thought downtown must be beautiful. We went to downtown. Wasn't really ours.
How about the financial institutions here?
Is not known as a country where people do offshore banking. They will not give a fresh foreigner who just arrived here a full bank account. It's because the compliance people, so the people who deal with anti-money laundering in the bank, they have personal responsibility. Extremely high hurdles that I've never heard anywhere in the world. You have money from abroad that you would like to invest. There's not a lot of reason to bring it into the Paraguayan banking system. One thing that works quite well is stablecoin banks. 10 years ago, you had the wave of Wise and Revolut and N26 in Germany. Now we have a second wave, which is these neobanks based on stablecoins. If I bring my legal money in Germany into a stablecoin, move the stablecoin to Paraguay, and that person cashes it out to his bank account, that's 100% legal.
Tom, welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining me today. I would like to ask you to, well, you have been living abroad in various countries as far as I know.
Yeah.
And you have been in finance or investing for a long time. If you could give me like a little introduction about where you have been living, what were the experiences, just in a nutshell, before we go for the questions that I have prepared for you.
So basically, I grew up in Germany, but spent most of my time studying and working abroad. So I studied finance and started working for an American bank in London for 8 years, and afterwards for a smaller bank, another 8 to 10 years. I studied in 4 different countries, in 2 years in Germany, 1 year in Madrid, 1 year in Paris, and 1 year in Oxford. So that was already the kind of the groundwork for me, kind of trying to see the world. Yeah, and after having lived in those 3 foreign countries, I wasn't really happy to go back to Germany, so I went to London. And in London, the banks, they work in a way that they cover whole of Europe, so Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So when you work in London, in the like covering businesses in the banking sector, you can have a client in Africa, you can have a client in Budapest and in Germany. So that's very diverse, and I really like that. And since then, yeah, after those 8 years, I spent eight years in Germany, in Berlin, but still working with clients outside of Germany. So 90% of my work is in English and with international clients. The work in the bank was mainly corporate clients, or exclusively corporate clients, large corporations. But in the last years, I've been pivoting more towards investing and working with private clients. I haven't really made a real business out of that yet. That's my plan for this year.
Okay.
To get that going. The last years, I did a lot of the work myself. I worked with a couple of people, but not kind of publicly. Yeah, and in 2022, my wife and I started. After we spent 8 years in Germany, that was enough for us. We spent time in London together. We traveled together in the meantime. So we thought, what would be the next step? So we put everything in storage. We canceled our apartment. We put it in storage and traveled for 2 years in different countries. Went to Egypt, Latvia, Serbia, Portugal, Spain, Mexico, and that was great. And we always spent around 3 months in every location, because I'm not interested in just being a tourist everywhere. So I want to kind of get to know the people.
Like truly experience how it is living in that country.
Exactly.
Right.
That's why we take Airbnbs and spend 3 months everywhere. Then you get to, you have a favorite cafe, you get to know the waiters, you talk a bit, you get to know the culture and so on. So we did that for 2 years, but then that gets really exhausting. You just live out of your backpack and your suitcase. So we decided we wanted to kind of find a base somewhere, not forever, but for the next years. And we found Paraguay. So, and we've been here for 1.5 years now, since July 2024. And yeah, that's why I'm here, I guess.
Awesome, awesome. I mean, yeah, Paraguay seems to be a very popular choice nowadays when it comes to this temporary living, because I mean, it's pretty rare to meet people here that do commit full time to, live here and die here in that sense. Like, I feel like for many of us, including me and my family, it tends to be like a temporary base, but the base nonetheless. And I understand what you're saying as well. Like, you after a while, like traveling the world, you do feel like you need something stable, something like fixated to one certain place or one certain country. But I would like to ask you about what were the experiences in the first couple of months when it comes to coming here, because I imagine you had your expectations about Paraguay. I mean, after all, it's a completely different continent. And if I understand correctly, you guys been living a lot in Europe, like in different countries in Europe. So how does it compare to your initial expectations? Like, did it fulfill them, or are there some things that surprised you about maybe the people, or just like personally about culture here? If you could talk about that.
So I think, first of all, like a lot of people, foreigners who come to Paraguay, we didn't have the intention to stay here for years. We also didn't have the intention to leave immediately, but we thought we set up our base here. We get our residency, our cedula and everything. And then maybe travel around some more. What we found was, and I think obviously a lot of people come here for taxes, right? So when you talk to a lot of people, including us, the taxes, but also the residency process, the growth of the company is usually what gets you here, but it's not enough to keep you here. What we felt was we really like the people here. We really like the culture. People are very kind and nice to foreigners. And we felt that in different countries, that wasn't the case. So we've seen other countries where the people are still nice, but they're not very extra friendly to foreigners.
Where did you experience this? Like that there's kind of like a distance?
For example, Latvia.
Okay.
Latvia, I'm not an expat. I've never been to Russia or something, but I think the cultures are similar. And people, once you know them, they're great people. But on the street, if you go to a new cafe and you order a cafe, or you ask someone on the street, they're very polite, but not very lovely, or they're not opening their arms and saying, wow, it's so fantastic that you're here.
Yeah, it doesn't come from the heart.
Exactly.
It's kind of like a customary thing to do. I guess that's how I could do it.
And we had a fantastic 3 months there, and we got to know a couple of people who were then really warm to us. But the average life here is easier, because the average person in the Uber or on the street or in the shop is like very friendly to foreigners. That's at least my experience. And I understand that we live in a bubble as Westerners here. We don't live in very poor areas of the country and so on. But in the area that I've seen, I've been like, people have been very kind to me. And I guess what when we first arrived here, we were a bit shocked. You step out of the hotel and you want to take a walk. As Germans, we love walking.
Sure.
Everywhere. I didn't have a car in the 8 years that we lived in Germany. We take public transport and we walk everywhere. We lived relatively central Berlin, and we could walk to the shops, and we would just go with a backpack to the shops and buy your stuff and come back. And then you step out of the hotel in Asuncion, and the pavement doesn't even work. There are holes in the pavement stops. And I was a bit depressed the first days, and I thought, ooh, that's going to be a problem. We later figured out that if you live in the right areas, the pavements are okay, and you get used to it. So now when I see a pavement that is not working or has a hole in it, I don't care. I just make a turn or take the other side or something. So I think the infrastructure, the state of the streets and the pavements, and we thought downtown must be beautiful. We went to downtown, wasn't really ours. Yeah. But again, now that we live in a residential area and we know where to walk and which streets to take, it's absolutely fine. But I was a bit shocked with that at the beginning, because obviously Germany is a rich country and Paraguay is on average a poor country. And that's a huge difference. Although Germany is going down and Paraguay is going up probably, but when you see the infrastructure, there's a huge difference. But you know what? You learn to ignore that. When I came here, it bothered me. And then after a couple of months, I don't even look at that anymore.
Yeah.
And that's very refreshing for your mind, because I'm someone at work who was very stressed easily. And that really gives you let go of the stress because you accept it, you know?
Yeah, I guess it becomes normal after a while,
Yeah,
especially you get accustomed to it. It's very true. But how about the financial institutions here? When it comes to banking, like how simple it was to set it up, or what was the process there for you as a foreigner? What was the experience?
Yeah. So first of all, when we came here, I thought, well, great, we can bring some money here. And I love exploring developing countries and the financial system, because I have a financial background. But then you come here and you realize a lot of things about the financial system are actually difficult. So Paraguay is not known as a country where people do offshore banking. So no person living in Germany would have a Paraguayan bank account, but they might have a Panamanian bank account, because Panama is known for a robust banking system. So when you arrive here, first of all, you need your cedula. So you have obviously the temporary residency, which is good for 2 years. Once you have that, you can apply for the cedula and you get the little plastic ID card. Without that, it's really difficult to get anything done here. With this, Paraguay, like every developing country, has a big issue with unbanked people. So I spent a lot of time with a bank in Africa, and a lot of people in Africa don't have banks, right?
Right.
If you're a person selling bananas on the street, you can get by, but you don't have a banking account. You can have cash transfer, but it's also dangerous every evening walking around with your cash and so on. So different countries tackle the situation differently. For example, in Kenya, I spent a lot of time in Kenya, in Africa. They, even before you had anything of that sort in Europe, they had mobile banking. And you could even have an old flip phone with that. You didn't need a smartphone. It's easy to have an app on a smartphone and do banking.
Yeah,
but with an old, you can send like money via text messages.
That's crazy.
I was with an Uber driver. He had to put gas in his tank, and he was just there with his old mobile phone, and that was it. Yeah, and that's like over 10 years ago.
All right.
And in Paraguay, they solved the situation. very elegantly, actually, you have to give them that, by having something called cuenta digital, a digital bank account. I think it's also sometimes called cuenta básica, a basic bank account. What that means is you just need your cedula. You don't need to show where you're living. You don't need to show where you're working or anything. You just need your cedula. You download the app from that bank. Every Paraguayan bank has to do that. So it doesn't matter if you're Ueno or Banco Atlas or Itaú or all the other banks. Everyone is offering that. Some are easier than others to do. The easiest for me was Ueno Bank, because they're already a native digital bank, right? Banco Atlas, all the other banks started as normal banks, like Deutsche Bank in Germany started as a normal analog bank and is now going digital, or for the last 10, 20 years. A bank like Ueno started digital. So the process for me was very smooth. You just scan, you take the app, you scan your cedula, you take a selfie, maybe with the cedula here, or video selfie, or whatever they want. And that's it. Like the next day you have a bank account. However, it's a basic bank account. So they have 3 minimum salaries that you can only pay into the bank account each month. So one minimum salary is roughly $350. So you're around $1,100 a month that you can pay in. So it's no good if you have a business and you have $10,000 to put into the bank account. But it works well to put in this amount every month, and you can pay your rent with that.
Yeah, I guess especially for people here that get the, I don't know, minimum wage, or I don't know how much they usually earn here on a monthly basis. Like for that, that's ideal.
Exactly. So for them, they just have their cedula. Another problem is I don't know how many people actually have the cedula, but you need it. Yeah. And then the base salary, the minimum salary is around $350 per month. And for them, it's more than enough. And you can have, I think, up to 4 of those. So you can have you can test different banks as well. Yeah, so Paraguay did a fantastic job with this, which also allows us as foreigners within a couple of days to have your first bank account. Yeah, and you get a Visa card and you can pay. They have a QR code payment here in every shop. If you say, I want to pay with QR code, you just scan it from your app and it's paid. So it's very easy to get started here.
Where do the complications arise?
The complications are if you want to go to the next level. So first of all, if you want a US dollar or a euro account, that's not part of the Cuenta Básica. Secondly, if you want to put more than $1,100 a month into the bank account. And if you want to do transfers, foreign transfers. So you want to move money from Europe to Paraguay, or from Paraguay to Europe, or to the United States. That doesn't work with Cuenta Básica. So you need a full bank account for that. And for that full bank account, there are very high hurdles. Because what I heard, I don't know if it's true, is because the compliance people, so the people who deal with anti-money laundering in the bank, they have personal responsibility, which is obviously an extremely high hurdle that I've never heard anywhere in the world before. So they will not give a fresh foreigner who just arrived here a full bank account. You need to have, if you're self-employed, you need to have 6 months of monthly VAT declarations. If you show that to them, they will usually open a bank account to you. There might be other options, but that's the normal one. That's tricky. However, you don't really need that, because unless you have a business, because most people will not choose to bank in Paraguay in a bigger dimension.
Okay.
Right? Paraguay doesn't have a very good access to international stock exchanges, for example. Yeah. You have one crypto company here. It's called X4T. You can do crypto here. They're quite expensive, but I heard, I haven't used them, but I heard that they're quite good. But in terms of stock exchange or bonds and all that, it's difficult here. So why would you go through the hassle of doing all this and then trying to go through a Paraguayan bank to access the New York Stock Exchange if you can take your cedula and open, for example, an interactive broker's account, which is a US brokerage, and you can do whatever you want. You can trade European stocks, US stocks, South American stocks. So that's usually what people go for, the international brokers. So yes, it works. You can have a bigger bank or more full bank account. And if you're able to, go for it. You get a lot of discounts if you get their credit cards. You might have seen that when you go into shops or you go to a gas station, you get 10 to 40% off. So if you have a premium credit card from them, you can save a lot of money, but it's a big hurdle to get there.
When it comes to the bureaucracy involved in, for instance, like setting up offshore bank accounts, what unexpected challenges did you experience, or because many people give up on it, so that's why I'm curious.
Well, one thing you have to understand is the banking system is not what it used to be 10 years ago.
Right.
It's not even what it used to be 5 years ago. In the European Union, for example, there has been an anti-money laundering directive from 2021. So it's 5 years ago, not even 5 years ago. It was August, I think, 2021. And it's very, very, very strict. So if you have any kind of funds where it's not crystal clear where they come from, it's suddenly your responsibility as the banking client to show the bank
that you're legit,
that you're not a criminal.
Yeah, right.
So, which is debatable if that's okay, because normally in law you have something that says you're innocent until proven guilty. Here we have the opposite. You're kind of guilty until you prove you're innocent.
Guilty, right?
And this is not. I'm not judging here, it just is what it is. We have to know the rules and play them and play the rules in the area that they're set, right? So the anti-money laundering means that, first of all, the European Union, for the expats that come from there, has a blacklist of uncooperative countries with regards to banking and anti-money laundering. And Panama, for example, is on that list. So if I have a bank account in Panama, which I can open, no problem, and I make a lot of money there, and I run my business through that, and in 5 years I go back to Germany or Spain or Hungary or whatever, and I move €1 to there, they will say, stop it. We want to know exactly where that money comes from. It's a blacklisted country. There's not going to happen anything with that money. You can keep it in Panama. If you bring it to Europe, you need to have like really good documentation. It's a very high hurdle to bring that money back to Europe. Okay, but that's Panama, which is an extreme case. Paraguay, for example, is not on that list. Okay, so it's not a blacklisted. By the way, the blacklist is not just money laundering, it's more about the taxes. So for some reason, the European Union thinks that the taxes in Panama are lower than in Paraguay. And I think it's about corporate taxes or something like that. So anyway, you don't have this, but you still have the problem with money laundering hurdle rate or hurdles.
Right.
So everything you do nowadays, you need to prove where it comes from. That's the most important suggestion I have for people is document everything. Yeah, if you make money and you're a freelancer, keep your receipts where the money came from, right? If you make money trading stocks, keep those receipts. So it is easy to, as a foreigner, to open those accounts. I think the hurdle will, or the difficulties will arise once you want to move money back and forth. Okay, so that's why you should think ahead.
Most people think they are losing money on international transfers because the fees are too high. Turns out the fee is only part of the problem. It's also the exchange rate markup that banks hide, which is why for the past few years, I've handled every single international payment through Wise. Wise is essentially a multi-currency account that lets you hold 40 currencies in the same one place at real mid-market rate. The exact same rate you see on Google, for instance. You also get local bank details in over 22 currencies, so clients and platforms can pay you like a local, while also 74% of transfers arrive in under 20 seconds. And best of all, it's completely free to open a personal account, so no monthly fees, no minimum balance. So you can sign up at the currency and see exactly what you've been losing before you ever commit to anything. Right now, you can get started for free by going to a link in the description below.
If you're going to make a lot of money the next 10 years and then want to buy a house in Europe with that, then don't bank in Panama, right? Maybe even bank in Europe or in Switzerland, right? Switzerland is not EU, you can bank in Switzerland, and it'll be easier to get that money to your home country. So I guess that's the whole thing. Everything today is about anti-money laundering, anti-terror financing, and so on. And so you always need to prove to every bank in every step where the money comes from. And that makes things annoying. And the second thing is, or the last thing is, depending on where your residency is, banks will take you or not. So banks have an internal grid where they divide countries in. Some people have 3 categories, some have 4. Paraguay is typically in the highest category, in the risky category. So if you want to go to Revolut, for example, which is a great company, and they say, where do you live? And you say in Paraguay, they say, no thanks. And same with a lot of others. So you need to find, say, offshore banking is easy if you have the right companies. For example, Interactive Brokers has no problem with Paraguayan residency. So the process should be relatively smooth if you can show where your money is coming from.
Right.
Because if you open the account and you need to move the money to the account, but they will want to ask you where the money comes from.
So you always obviously need to provide proof, regardless of which bank are you going to be working with. But at the same time, let's say somebody comes here and maybe for the tax benefits, maybe for the living, like the lifestyle, which is understandable. So how do you solve the issue of like moving money in and out the country, like larger sums or whatever from your business, if you do business here or abroad? Like how to solve that issue the simplest possible way, considering the banks here and also offshore accounts.
The thing is, I don't think you have to solve that.
Okay.
Because let's say you have 2 cuenta básicas, and you every month you put $1,100 on there. You can use that to pay for your bills and your electricity and your rent and your groceries. So if you have money from abroad that you would like to invest, there's not a lot of reason to bring it into the Paraguayan banking system. You can, yes, but it's a high hurdle. And what do you do with it here? So as I just said, there's really no point in bringing the money here to invest in the New York Stock Exchange. You rather do that through Interactive Brokers.
Yeah.
Right?
But for instance, if you want to buy like a house or something which like costs more money, like
so that I don't have first-hand experience with that because I'm not interested in buying a house here at the moment. But there are several ways to do that. You can have Wise. Wise doesn't allow Paraguay. So you would have to have it from before. You can do an international transfer from Germany or Europe or the US, I guess. I heard that some companies accept cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin. There's a thing for the last 5 years, so-called stablecoins.
Right.
So you have on Ethereum or Solana, so on these crypto rails, you have US dollars. That actually works quite nice. So you have money in Germany or in Europe, you turn it into this US dollar stablecoin, move it to Paraguay. But you need someone who sells the real estate for that stablecoin. So you need to talk to them before. There are dozens of possibilities. Some people take Bitcoin directly. If you don't have Bitcoin, you just turn it into Bitcoin in your home country, your money, and then send the Bitcoin to the seller. Or you do the same thing with stablecoins or with international transfers. But moving $100,000 or $50,000 to a Paraguayan bank account just to buy real estate seems overly complicated. Sometimes you might have to do that because the seller, it's all about the seller. If the seller says, I want to be paid from a Paraguayan bank account for compliance reasons, okay, yeah, you need to go through that step. But there are other ways. And I think the more we advance, we're not the only people having issues with this whole banking system. The banking system is based on a mindset from decades ago, right? And we don't have to accept that. And there are legal ways to circumvent that. Yeah. So if I bring my legal money in Germany into a stable coin, move the stable coin to Paraguay, and that person cashes it out to its bank account, that's 100% legal. It's 100% transparent because everyone can see that these stable coins went from this address to that address. It's not even private, or it's not even a privacy topic. So there are options. And one thing that works quite well is there are new, some call them stablecoin banks, some call them crypto neo banks or something. So 10 years ago, you had the wave of Wise and Revolut and N26 in Germany. So we called them the neo banks. Those were banks who started with an app. So they were already advantaged because they didn't have Deutsche Bank servers from the 60s. And so they could start fresh. Now we have a second wave, which is these neobanks based on stablecoins. And there are like literally 50 of them. Yeah, all the big crypto companies have them: Coinbase, Kraken, Ledger. They have their own crypto cards. There's some called Cast or Redot. So there are a lot of them. You have to be careful because a lot of them will go under. At the moment, we have a lot of competition. Couple will survive, and a lot of them will not survive. So be careful. Don't move too much money to them. And they give you a credit card, and you can pay here in Paraguay, right? So wherever you have your money, in Panama or in Germany or Hungary or Switzerland, you turn it into a stable coin, charge your card with it, and pay here. And they even allow payouts to local banks. So you can use these cards. There's one called Meru, M-E-R-U. It's in Spanish. It's for Latin American freelancers. And they have a function to pay out the stable coins in local currency, in Guarani, to a Paraguayan cuenta básica.
Yeah.
So you can recharge the $1,100 each month by turning your bank account into a stable coin, moving that stable coin to Meru app, and getting it in Guarani.
Right.
So lots of options. I think we'll have to wait another 5 years until this gets a bit easier.
Sure, yeah? Sure. Now it's kind of like a niche of, for people that are interested in this and know like how it works. But yeah, obviously it's far from being used absolutely universally.
Exactly.
But it's good that it exists. Like 100% agree. So you're essentially saying that when it comes to the bureaucracy and opening bank accounts here, when it comes to large sums of money, it's much easier to just bypass the system altogether through legal means, through these digital assets or stable coins or whatever it may be, and to bring that money into the country through through those channels, if I understand correctly.
Yeah. I guess that's how I do it.
Sure.
I guess it's individual. Some people, I've spoken to Germans who say, I don't want to have anything to do with Germany. I don't want to have a cent there. I don't want to have. We still have a lot of things in Germany, and I'm comfortable just having my savings there and living here. I don't need to bring every last cent over. So yeah, I think both works, but I think what's important for your listeners or viewers to know is you don't have to, just because Paraguay is your base, that doesn't mean you have to have all your money here. Remember, in these times of anti-money laundering laws, every time you move your money from one bank to another, you need to prove that. Just imagine you have your money in Hungary, you move it to Paraguay, then you decide Paraguay is not for you, you move to Panama, you move it to Panama, then you go to South Africa, and then good luck showing the bank in South Africa that it originally came from Hungary, right? So my advice is always move your money as few times as possible, so it's easier to show where it's coming from.
Right. And the good thing in these crypto way, I guess, it's completely transparent, so it's easily traceable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's why this whole narrative of criminals using Bitcoin. Yes, it's a small part. It's a very small part of the transactions, but it's a stupid part because everything is you can go back in every step. It's called pseudo-anonymous. It doesn't have your name next to it, but it has an address. And if they see that at the end you paid, they can follow it back. So I think the cryptocurrencies are good because yes, they are transparent. You have the paper trail. It's not going into a nirvana and then reappearing somewhere. Yeah, exactly.
Right. The void, the space, and then they just pop out. Okay, yeah. And how about so for digital nomads, because do you consider yourself a digital nomad? I mean, you work online and you move. I don't know.
I always consider digital nomads people who go from country to country.
Yeah.
I don't like.
You're not that right now.
We've been here for 1.5 years. Maybe expat.
I
don't care. I mean, yes, I work on the laptop in in a cafe, so maybe that makes me a digital nomad.
Okay. When it comes to for example, how to keep your money, do you think it's better to keep it in assets or keep it in a bank account?
In terms of investing?
Yeah. Or just long term, so that so that it doesn't lose its value.
So I'm a huge fan of diversification. There's a saying in investing: there's no free lunch. So if someone offers you 20% returns per day, it's a scam. I guarantee you. Okay. And if someone offers you 20% per year, it's probably also a scam, right? Historical returns in the stock market were like 8% a year. So if someone offers you much more, that means the risk goes up. That's what the saying means. There's no free lunch in investing.
Sure.
But there's one free lunch, which is diversification. With diversification, you can have, let's say you have one stock and you have a gold coin, right? The stock, let's say Tesla, goes up or goes down. And the gold coin goes up and goes down in value. By holding both, you reduced your risk, but the opportunity to make money is still the same. Right? Not the same as the stock, but same as the package. So you have one stock in your portfolio, you have a certain risk and a certain reward. You have 10 stocks, you might have the same reward, but a lower risk. Right? Because in investing, nobody knows for sure anything, ever. If somebody tells you, do this, it's going to work, he's either naive or he's lying. So nobody knows. And because nobody knows, you need to diversify. So what does that mean? Diversification means you always have, the basis is always you have an emergency account. If you live in Paraguay, you have a cuenta básica with a card, a local one, and you have $1,000 or maybe $5,000, or depending who you are, or 500, or as emergency cost. Yeah, you're in the hospital, they say we need $500 now, you need to be able to pay that. That's always the basis for everything. Don't even think about anything else before you don't have a local bank account which can save your ass if something happens. Yeah, you fall and you need a new tooth, or you have an accident.
Sure.
Okay, that's that. Then now, 20 years ago, when I was a child, I had a little savings account, and that savings account, and for every birthday, my parents put some money into there.
Oh, that's cool.
And when I was 18, I got the money for my driving license. That for those 18 years, I earned 6-7% in interest. And you have inflation. So the 6-7 is maybe only 4-5% real, but that's a really good. Maybe it's a little bit less, but you did get a real interest rate. Real interest rate means above inflation. If everything gets more expensive by 5% every year, and somebody offers you to give you 5% interest on your money, you're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So if everything gets more expensive by 5%, you want 7% on your savings, right? So this used to be the case. Since the financial crisis, that's no longer the case. Usually, often, the real interest rate is negative. So the inflation is higher than what the bank pays you, right? There's some exceptions. So
it's not worth keeping your money in dollars or euros or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
So keeping it in what we call fiat currency, FIAT, it has nothing to do with the car. It's the name for currencies that are not backed with anything. So a gold-backed currency is okay, but the dollar and the euro is not backed by anything, right? You can't go to the bank and say, give me a gold coin or give me a piece of whatever, copper. Yeah, it doesn't work that way. So these currencies don't work because the central banks, the governments take in taxpayer money, but it's not enough. They're not good at managing money, the governments. They always need more than they spend.
Yeah.
Or they always spend more than they take in through taxes. So they need to print money. It's obviously more complicated than that, but it's basically creating money out of thin air. If I sit here and I have a $10 note and somebody's creating $10 out of nothing, that's stupid. I'm not going to keep that $10 note. I'm going to keep it to buy groceries in 2 days. Maybe I keep some, as I said, with the emergency fund. But keeping money in so-called fiat currency, US dollar, Europe, is not a wise thing to do, unless you need the money for a specific purchase over the next 6 months to 2 years, right? If you want to buy a car in a year's time, yeah, okay, keep it in euros. So, and then the question is, what else do you have? You have some things that are quasi money, like gold and silver. Gold and silver have been money for thousands of years and have held their purchasing power very well, very well. Yeah. So there's always the saying that for an ounce of gold, which is 31 gram, you could buy a tunica in Rome, and you can today, if you go to the expensive London district, you can buy a tailor-made suit 2,000 years later. Right. Well, now gold has gone up, that it's actually going better. Yeah. But 2 years ago, that was the case. So silver is a bit similar. Silver is half industrial use, half monetary, right? And then you have new forms of quasi-money, which you could say is Bitcoin. Yeah. So you have these things. Bitcoin is much more risky and much newer and less proven, but still an interesting part of that. So you could say, I want money, but instead of keeping it in US dollars in Europe and euros, I'm going to buy some gold, silver, and Bitcoin. And you can obviously buy the gold physical, but that's a security issue in a country like Paraguay, but also in other countries. I wouldn't do that. You can keep it in a different country. You can buy an you can buy a security with that. So you can go to interactive brokers and say, I want to buy gold, and it's digital there. It's not perfect, but it's good. Same thing with silver, same thing with Bitcoin.
So how does it compare to physical gold? I mean, the digital one, like.
The digital one is guaranteed by someone. If someone says, I'm going to give you a security, which says you have $500 in gold, then the first question I ask, so where's the gold? Are you keeping it?
Yeah.
And usually some don't. So they use futures or derivatives to just make a monetary digital transaction. I don't like that. I want to buy something digital where someone is actually physically holding that.
Like the same person or company or
yeah, it's a company that issues this exchange traded product. They're called ETPs, and they also hold the gold.
Before we continue, most people who hold crypto have thought about security. They moved off the sketchy exchanges, they've got two-factor authentication on, they feel reasonably safe. Security isn't the issue, but the custody question, who actually controls your private keys, that's where the exposure is. And that is why I'm such a huge fan of Ledger. You see, when your crypto sits on an exchange, the exchange holds the private keys, not you. Between 2011 and 2024, over $15 billion worth of cryptocurrency was stolen from exchanges. Ledger moves your private keys completely offline. They never touch the internet. Through the Ledger Wallet app, you can buy, swap, stake, and manage up to 15,000 coins and tokens, with every transaction requiring physical confirmation on the device itself. No app, no software, no hacker can move your funds without you physically approving it. Best of all, every Ledger device comes with a 30-day return policy, and they ship internationally. Right now, you can get started by going to the link in the description below.
And you need to trust them, that they have the gold, that they're not bad actors, and so on. But there are options to do that, right? So with gold, silver, Bitcoin, you have always the option to have it physical. Also Bitcoin, you can go on a crypto exchange and buy the Bitcoin and hold it yourself and everything. Or you just go to interactive brokers and you say, I'm going to buy an exchange traded product with the underlying being Bitcoin. Yeah, and then you have gold and silver have gone really well this year because of everything that's happening in the world, right? Geopolitically is difficult.
Well, the less people trust the old system, I guess, the more it strengthens the new one. So
and we're at a point where the percentage of debt of countries is going so high that the question is, is it even possible to ever pay it back? The money that we owe to ourselves, to others. It's a complicated topic, and if you don't want to have that risk, you're going to go to gold, silver, Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is the most risky of those. Then comes silver, and gold is the most proven one. So you have this, and this is also called the debasement trade. Debasement means debasement of currency. If you create new euros every month to finance whatever you want to finance, then the person holding a 10 euro note is at the losing end of that trade.
Of course.
It's a debasement of the overall currency. And that's why you hold gold, silver, Bitcoin. And even the big banks are using this term debasement trade in the last 6 months or 12 months more and more, because the trust in the system is going away, right? So this is a great way to hold some of your assets. And by the way, it's not financial advice. Every person,
Look,
person needs to do their own research, right? And discuss it with a financial advisor, what is good for them, because every asset that you can invest in has their own risk and reward, and you need to understand it. But this is just the overall. Then you go to, if you look at, then you have real estate, which is not technically in that because it's not quasi-money or something. But it's still a very good way for long periods of time to keep your wealth, right? Because the house is still the house. You can still live in it. It can go up and down, but it's still something tangible, right? And then you have stocks, which is a stock is basically just a small percentage that you as an owner hold in a company. So if Tesla as a company exists and I buy one Tesla share, I'm a very, very small owner of Tesla. And if I have a lot of shares, I can even go to their annual meeting and vote.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah,
So
right.
the more you own, if you have a very small company and you have a lot of money, you could own 20% of the company. You are the owner. So the CEO of a company works for you and the other shareholders. That's a stock.
Right.
Yeah. And that's long term so far been always in history the best way long term.
Yeah.
Not over a year or 2 or 5, but over 20, 30, 40 years. It's the best one because it's so-called productive capital. It's a company that has employees, it produces goods, it has factories, it has lawyers, it grows ideally, and you don't have to do anything. You put money in and that's it. And if they have money to spare in a year, you get a dividend, right? So stocks is a great way of investing long-term.
Do you think it's still true?
That's a tricky question.
Yeah. Because I mean,
coming back to what I said in the beginning, you need to diversify. Why do you need to diversify? Because nobody can tell you what's going to work and how. I can't. I have no idea.
Sure.
I do this professionally, and I can't tell you what's going to happen. The gold price, I could tell you buy a gold coin today and it drops by 50% tomorrow. I can say, oh, I like Bitcoin is an interesting instrument and it can go away tomorrow. I don't know. It can get hacked or something. It's very unlikely, but it's possible.
There's always possible.
So all you can do, I think, in these times is have a bit of everything. Because then you're diversified. The problem with stocks is there are a lot of problems with stocks. But the basis is still it's productive capital. People are out there working. People are doing research, right? So there's artificial intelligence out there. But these companies are not just sitting there and saying, I don't care. They have departments researching how they can implement artificial intelligence. Not every company.
Right.
But that's why I never tell people to buy individual stocks. They always buy so-called ETFs, exchange traded funds, which are basically stock funds, which have a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand stocks in them. And you can trade that vehicle. You can say, I have 500 euros and I want to buy an ETF that covers the biggest companies in the world. One click on Interactive Brokers, right? Whether that goes up or down over the next 10 years, I can't tell you.
Yeah.
But the idea is, as I just said, that you bet a little bit on the companies doing their own research and staying up to date with what's happening.
About innovation or technology or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't, there are financial advisors, especially in the US, who say put all of your money in these stock funds. And I say, I'm not sure. I wouldn't put all of it, but I think it's an important part. And within these stock funds called ETFs, you can have ETFs focused on technology. You can have active ETFs where a team of 50 people sit there all day, every day, analyzing tech companies and just putting the good ones in the basket. And you hold that ETF. They're a bit more expensive. So a cheap ETF costs 0.2% a year in fees. This one I just mentioned could be 0.7 or 0.9%, but it should always be below 1%.
Okay.
So you have options there in the stock area, and then finally you have bonds. Bonds is just like someone you lend money to someone and mainly this means to governments. So you can give the German government money and they pay you interest. But I see, I have no use for that anymore because the countries are overdebted. They have shown that they're not good stewards of money. And I'm not talking about specific countries, like all of them, or most of them. So I think the bond part is really tricky. I think it's good to keep your money 1 to 3 years.
Okay.
If you say, in 2 years, I want to buy a house, don't just let it sit there in euros. Let it earn some interest, right? Yeah, okay. But as a long-term strategy, I'm not a fan of that. And then you have the last part, there are more, but the last part in my categories is the commodities, right? So gold and silver are part commodities, part money. Many people say gold is money because it has been money for 5,000 years. Silver is half industrial, half money. But then you have copper, you have oil, you have agricultural, you have lithium, you have cobalt. So a lot of different metals, non-metals. And the good thing about all these commodities is it's very difficult to get them out of the earth, right? Oil is maybe a bit different, but for every ounce of copper you need, for every electric vehicle needs copper. Where does that money come? Where does that metal come from? It comes from people who drive massive diesel trucks, dig up the earth, put the earth through some kind of mechanism and pull the copper out. That's really difficult. So as opposed to the European Central Bank or the Federal Reserve, who can just press the money, and here's the money.
It's a big difference.
You can't print the copper. You can't print the gold. You can't print the Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a bit different because it's kind of scarce, but in a digital way. But yeah, you can't just, and that's why this whole thing, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. Okay, fine, do it. But I can tell you, you need this amount of million tons or whatever of copper and silver and everything for the electric vehicles and for the wind turbines and the solar panels and everything. And tell me how you get that copper out of the earth, right? So there's a bit of delusion there in my view. And that's why some people are talking about being in a new commodity super cycle. I don't know. I'm not an expert in commodities, but I think it makes sense that you want to be in things that the government cannot print with a push of a button.
So going back to real estate, like how do you see real estate here or in any other third world country or Paraguay specifically? Like,
I think it's interesting. Every time I pass a real estate agency, I look at these things. I think it has a lot of advantages. It has the advantage that you have let's say you buy an apartment in the country you live in Paraguay or Panama or where it's your apartment. If you travel the world and something stupid happens in the world, you can come back to your country. You have the ID card. You can say, hey, I'm a resident. You have to let me in. And then you go to your apartment and it's waiting there for you. That's quite
gives you a sense of
relieving,
security.
Right?
Right.
It's a really nice thought for me as well. The good thing is, in terms of privacy, usually, you know that there's something called the CRS where the banks internationally exchange data with each other. Paraguay is not part of that system, but I bet you they will be at some point. Because a lot of, like Georgia, for example, never was, and people were putting their money, like there was a lot of money laundering happening there, and boom, and they signed the CRS, and now they're sending everything to your home country, right? Real estate is different. There's no automatic reporting. So it's also a nice way of diversifying without the whole world knowing what you have, in a fully legal sense, right? I'm never talking about it's stupid to do tax evasion or something like that, because that's not the way I do business. But to have privacy is a good thing. right? So that's positive. It's also good because sometimes it gives you, Paraguay is different, but if you're in other countries like Panama or Argentina, or actually most Latin American countries, there's almost always one residency option, which is like a fixed income. If you prove the government that you have 1,000 or 2,000 or whatever it is dollars a month in income, in fixed in every month income, you get a residency. But if you don't have that, you don't. Paraguay is different, but other countries. If you have 1 or 2 or 3 of those, you have income because you can put it on Airbnb. And suddenly you can get that residency. And you can use real estate in Paraguay to get your residency in Panama because you're getting the money. It doesn't have to be in that country, right? If you earn money through other means, that's also fine, but it's not fixed money often, right? If you're a freelancer, sometimes you earn a lot of money, sometimes you earn less. So I think that's another advantage. You can also participate in a growing economy. So for example, Germany hasn't grown for 6 or 7 years in a real after inflation way. It's stagnating. Paraguay is growing. It's, I think, the second or third fastest growing country in South America. It's amazing. It's a relatively poor country, but it's on a good trajectory. Yeah, some people want to take that. They want to be part of that, right?
Part of the boom. Well, it's very true. I mean, sorry, just to add, because yeah, like we had a couple of friends that visited Argentina, for instance, and yeah, I mean, you know, they had been a wealthy country in the past. Like you do see the infrastructure and everything, but it's so outdated at this point that when they came back, they said that, yeah, like Paraguay, even for a South American country, it's very, very modern, especially when you see the new buildings being built. Like it's very like up to date when it comes to real estate in general.
Exactly. And then in business, everything is demand and supply. Like the price is always demand and supply. If you have very little supply, it doesn't mean. So, for example, the fact that Bitcoin is fixed to 21 million Bitcoins doesn't mean it's worth anything, right? You need the demand. It's good that it's fixed, or that gold it's very difficult to get gold out of the ground nowadays, but that doesn't make it valuable. You need the demand as well. So you have demand and supply. If in Paraguay you have demand, because foreigners are coming here, the country is growing. When a country is growing, the best thing that can happen to a developing country is to have a lot of poor people move in the middle class. It doesn't matter if you're in the middle class or the high. Who cares if you have a Porsche or something? Nobody cares. What's important is that you go from living a very desperate life, or you live in a wooden hut or in a favela or something like that, and you move up to something where you have a concrete house. That's the real gain in life, right? In developing countries.
Do you see it here?
It's always tricky because you have to look at who's gaining from growth. It's not automatic that if you have growth that people will come out of poverty. But I think overall, so for example, if we look at where we spend our money, that's not going to someone who lives in a hut.
Yeah.
Right?
Probably.
It probably goes to the landlord. I'm not making my landlord much richer by paying him rent. However, I'm going to supermarkets, and there are people there earning minimum wage, and by us going there, you need more supermarkets and more products, and the prices rise a little bit. And so I do think indirectly it helps. I'm a capitalist, a liberal or capitalist, and I do think that if you let a system go within a certain area, like
within boundaries.
Frame, yeah, exactly, within boundaries, then I think if you look at rich and poor countries, I do think that good capitalism Not like, screw you, capitalism, like we are only do what. If you do it right, I think people do come out of the poor. There's still a lot of things to be done and that people could do better. But I do think that growth helps everyone. It helps the lower middle class get to higher middle class, but it also helps people from here go higher. For example, you have all these buildings here. We live in one of these multifamily buildings as well in these towers. And you have 24-hour security. Those are minimum wage people. And they have jobs now, and there are a lot of security jobs in these buildings, right? So yeah, I do think it also helps people from the lower class. And so if you want to participate in that, that's fine, but they're building so many buildings. So the question is, where will it end? Will it end that the demand, we know the demand has gone up, because if you talk to people that were here 5 years ago, they say, yeah, they had to build because foreigners were coming, Argentinians and Brazilians were coming.
Particularly, yeah.
And they have more demand. Now they're building supply. Like, where will it stop? Will they be reasonable and say, okay, now it's equilibrium, we'll stop here? Or will they do what always happens in the history of mankind? They'll build too much and then prices will come down.
Yeah, because like at least what I've heard from people is that the market seems to be a bit oversaturated at this point, especially when it comes to Asuncion, the parts where we live in, because many of those flats just stand empty. Like they are bought as investment by particularly Brazilians, Argentinians, I'm sure Germans as well. I heard many Polish people also like buying them as like long-term investment, but they can't rent it out because there's no one to rent it out to. Because if you want to make good money on real estate, you have to do Airbnbs, which obviously have like higher pricing, but those prices are usually paid by foreigners. And at least that's the word on the street. That there are still not enough foreigners to fill that demand, because if you look at these buildings, they're not really built for the locals. Not really, because obviously the locals, there's a little change when it comes to the affluence that the city has if you compare 20 years ago, but it's still, I feel like personally, I think it's still the existing middle and upper class benefiting from it, because the average person is still very, very poor, and obviously it's very difficult for them to climb the social ladder, so to speak, financially to get into a different layer within society. So I don't know, like how do you see that?
I heard that when you have money in Paraguay, you want a house with a garden and your barbecue and a pool.
Right.
I don't, from what I heard, is they don't really feel attracted by these buildings. But obviously, I mean, in our buildings we have there's a Paraguayan, but there's also a Chilean, there's a Venezuelan. So it's not just like Germans and Hungarians and British. There's also other...
but like foreigners in the sense of other South Americans as well. Like,
exactly.
That's what I meant, yeah.
But even that, I mean, it's difficult for me to say. Because it's difficult, I'm not investing in real estate at the moment.
Yeah.
Also, I think the quality of a lot of these buildings is mediocre.
Okay.
I think you have some really good ones, but there's a difference. When we came here originally, we saw the nice buildings and we thought, wow, we could buy this flat, we could buy this flat. That's okay, because in Germany, or I think general in Europe, when you have a new build, it's generally good quality. Here you have to watch out. Because there's good quality and there's average quality. That's fine.
There are different new builds.
And there's a price difference probably. And if you want to spend little money and turn it into an Airbnb and just, that's fine. Nobody needs a perfect apartment for an Airbnb to rent it out for 2 weeks, right? I'm not sure, again, when you look at history of investing, it's always been the same thing. There's always exuberance to the upside. And then there's like people with gold, for example, it went up and up and up and up. And then up here, people say, oh, it's going to triple from here and we're going to all get rich. And then that's when it goes down.
Right.
But then when it goes down so much that people say, oh, it's going to zero. Nobody uses gold anymore. It's a relic from the past. And for example, at the moment with crypto, it's going down, 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 down. And
you do hear people giving up.
You had the Financial Times yesterday. The Financial Times, the #1 newspaper for finance in the world, publish an article that Bitcoin, whose price is $70,000 currently, is still 70,000 too high. So they're basically saying it's going to zero. I don't know where it's going. It's not going to zero. Right. Yeah. So what I'm saying is the history of finance is always the same. It goes up too much, and then it goes down too much. So my bet, and I could be wrong, is that with the increased demand, they're building, but they'll build too much. And then there'll be 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe only 2 years where there's more, where it's fully saturated. And they will stop new builds, and then it comes down again, and then there will be an equilibrium, but it doesn't seem to be, for me, like the perfect opportunity. Right. And if you're investing, always make sure you invest in something that cannot be duplicated 1 million times, just like the money printer from the government. If you buy a random house in a random area, there are thousands of those. Sure. If you buy an apartment 5 minutes walking distance from Mariscal Lopez Mall, there will not be 100,000 of those. There's a limited area around Mariscal Lopez Mall, and if you have one there, it's also going to be more expensive. Yeah. But it's like gold. Gold is scarce. Silver is scarce. Copper is scarce. A little bit less than the other two, but it's still scarce. And real estate in general is not scarce, but good real estate is. So make sure you're in the right area.
But I mean, for living abroad in general, you do think that it's more, again, we're not giving advice to anybody, but like in your opinion, do you think it's better to keep a good portion of your money, regardless of what you're doing or where you're going or how much you earn, to keep it in gold, crypto, silver, and to kind of diversify the assets instead of just live off your bank account?
It depends how you're, I think if you have savings, nobody knows what happens, so diversify. That's all I can say. And yes, it's not always easy, because I mean, the dynamics of gold are very different to Bitcoin, are very different to real estate. You can't be an expert in everything. I'm not an expert in everything. So stick to what you know a little bit. So if you know gold and silver well, because your parents have already taught you, how to invest in it 20 years ago or so, then maybe focus a little bit more on that. So you have to understand what you own.
Yeah, of course.
Right? But I think if in doubt, a portfolio of a broad-based ETF, so stocks that pay a dividend, and some gold. But again, don't run around with physical gold in Paraguay, right? I mean, that's not going to do it. Either have it somewhere else or have it in paper form. Yeah. Right? Because there's a security aspect. You want your life to be better if you have savings, not worse. If you look around, if somebody's breaking into your apartment, that's not helpful. So going one step deeper would take a lot more time, because then you have to talk about the individual person's risk tolerance. So if you're like super risk tolerant, you're like maybe 25, you have your life ahead of you, you have a good job, you have cash flow, you're in a good financial position. Yeah, you can have a lot of Bitcoin and a lot of tech stocks. If you're already 60 and you're thinking of living off that money, yeah, you should probably have dividend stocks that pay you a quarterly dividend. Rather use maybe a little bit more gold. So it's very individual, this whole topic. Yeah. The only thing I can say is that don't put money in euros or in US dollars that you don't need for 20 years. That's just
suicidal.
Yes, it just goes away. I mean, it just goes away. We have inflation of 2 to 3%. The money printing, by the way, that's interesting. The inflation, the official inflation in Europe and in Western countries is 2 to 3% currently. In Paraguay, I actually don't think it's much higher, maybe a little bit, but Paraguay is pretty good as well. But the amount of new money they print on average over the last decade is 8%. So is inflation 3% or 8%? For me, it's 8%.
Sure.
That's tough, right? Because it's not easy to make 8% in. So, and that's why this whole thing, like hard currencies like gold and silver, Bitcoin, stocks, portfolio of that can get you higher percentages of returns over long, but all can go down 50% tomorrow, but you put only money in there that you don't need for a long time. So yeah, whatever you need in the next 2 years, you can't put in stocks.
And yeah, I would also like you to ask like passive income. Like, what do you think about it? Is it feasible in today's world, or?
I think you have to define passive income, because the thought sounds very romantic.
Yeah.
You sit back and you earn.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the options. Many people talk about real estate as passive. It's not passive. If you ever had real estate and you had someone, it's only passive if you don't live in there, because it doesn't give you cash flow if you live in there. So if you have an investment property and someone pays rent to you, initially you could think that's passive. But if you ever had a tenant, it's not. He calls you and this is not working and that's not working. You outsource that, okay? You give it to a management company. One day the management company calls you and says, there's a problem, we need to discuss it. It's semi-passive. In a way, you don't need to work hours and hours and hours to earn that money, but it's not fully passive. So ultimately, if you have savings, you wanna have a yield out of it. So you wanna have passive income. So yes, I do think having an apartment and renting that out as semi-passive income makes sense. If you have an ETF that has, let's say, a 2 or 3% dividend yield, that's nice as well, right? And that's truly passive, because you open an interactive broker's account. You put your money there in a broad, diversified ETF, global. You don't know which area, which geography will do well. You don't know which sectors, so you put it in all of them. Yeah, and you get 2.5% dividend yield. That means for $100,000, you get $2,500, or more than $200 a month, right? And that's truly passive. That's good. Gold doesn't pay yield, silver doesn't pay yield, Bitcoin doesn't pay yield, oil, copper don't pay yields. So that's, if you want to have a yield there, you need to go to mining companies that dig the gold out of the ground. But that's quite risky, and you have to know it. So my favorite passive income is dividends from stocks. Another passive income is obviously bonds or fixed money. You can give your bank $500, they fix it for 1 year and pay you an interest on that.
Okay.
But the money you get back is worth less than you gave them because of inflation. So the interest probably just gave you back what you lost in inflation. So it's not really fun.
It's not really worth it in that way.
You want to have passive income where the actual asset that generates the income stays more or less the same.
Constant, yeah.
Right? If you put it in bonds and you take the interests out, your money in real terms goes down. That doesn't help you. So it should be, real estate, it could be stocks.
So you would rather choose stocks or real estate because of the headache and involved with the tenants and taking care of it and everything?
Ask anyone who had tenants and they will tell you.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be terrible, and some people enjoy it, and it's fine.
Sure.
And they're obviously, but I know nothing about that, so I'm the wrong person to ask.
Right.
But maybe you at some point you interview someone who can talk about all the other ways of passive income. There are ways you can build websites, and you can do whatever affiliate marketing, and you can have a website where people get their Google hits and they go on the website and you just move them to the next website and you take a little cut. Tons of those things. I know nothing about that, but there's some interesting things out there. I like if you have a company, the company generates income, and the income can either go into paying down debt, investing in your future, or paying out a dividend. Those are the three options, right? Generally. And if you have a company that pays a lot of dividends, people say, why aren't they investing that in their own future? So if you buy an ETF with a high dividend, there are ETFs that are called high dividend global stocks.
Yeah.
That's a nice way if you need the money the next years and you want to live off the dividends. But there's a slight risk your stocks are not performing as well as you wish because they're focusing on dividend payout as opposed to investing in the future. It's not black and white, but that's the tendency. The good thing is even those companies should hold their value in real terms. So you get the payout and you still have the asset, as opposed to the euros that go down and you get the payments. And hopefully with real estate as well, right? You get the rent and you get the rent, but the real estate is still valuable, right? Just make sure that when you buy real estate, you have, and you calculate how much you'll make from it, you have a position in there that's refurbishment every 5 years or every 10 years. Because just buying an apartment and thinking that's it is not enough. You need to, somebody breaks a glass, you need to renew the glass, and after 10 years the wooden floor is done, you need to refurbish it and so on.
Yeah, renovation cost is always part of the game.
Yeah. And in the stocks, that's all inclusive, so to speak. You just buy it and keep it. That's why I like it so much.
How long does it take to master it?
I think
is there a level where you feel like, I got to figure it out, or is it like a?
First of all, what does mastering mean? I cannot tell you a single stock or asset in the world where I can guarantee you that over the next 6 months it goes up. So all I can do as an expert is the same thing. I can diversify, and I promise you, I've bought things where I was absolutely convinced they would go up and they went down 90%.
Right.
Yeah. So I think what you need to master is understanding the different asset classes broadly and then put some into each. It's not that difficult.
Right.
But you need a long-term time horizon. The shorter your time horizon is, the more you need to know about it. I think the most elegant thing you can do is, if you have a monthly income, to put 100 euros, 500 euros, whatever, into this ETF automatically, into the stock fund. So if the stock fund is down, you buy it cheap. If it's up, you buy it less cheap. But you do that over 10, 20 years. That's a nice way, because you don't have to think, is this expensive now? Is it going up? You don't care. You're putting money in over 10 or 20 years, and let's see what happens in 20 years. Statistically, it'll go up because it has always.
Right.
That's not a guarantee for the future. And I have to say, nowadays, there are really good podcasts and books for beginners on that topic. I mean,
Yeah, there's a lot of
I
information.
I have most of my knowledge to stay up to date on a day-to-day basis. What's happening in the market is for me through podcasts. It's amazing. I mean, just find 2-3 podcasts of people that talk about this and learn a little bit. But for me, health and finance are two things you can't outsource. That's always what I say. If you outsource your health to doctors, okay, good luck with that. They're great at what they're doing, but they're not going to keep you healthy all your life. You have to do that. And the same thing with finance. If you go to a bank, guess what the bank wants to do? They want to earn money for themselves. But you want to earn money for yourself.
Yeah.
So there's a conflict of interest.
Exactly.
So you need to know, I think, health and finance, you need to buy a book and read it and spend a little bit of time, but it's not that complicated.
Educate yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah, of course.
It's not that complicated because we don't know what happens anyway. You just put money in some of these buckets and let it run. And there's no guarantee it can all go down. There's never a guarantee it goes up. But what is the alternative? Keeping it in euro? I guarantee you it will go down.
Yeah.
At least with stocks and gold and Bitcoin and commodities, you have a chance that it goes up.
Yeah.
And statistically, a pretty good chance that it goes up.
Yeah. Like you still obviously take a risk. That's true for any investment, I think. But yeah, at least you have a chance to make some profit of it. Whereas, if you keep it in euros and dollars, then it's in the next 20 years, 100%.
It's gone.
It is suicidal. Last question. So like in the show, I like to ask guests to leave a question for the next guest that's coming. This kind of like mixes up the topics a little bit. And the previous guest has left the question of, have you thought about moving here to Paraguay or moving abroad in general as from a spiritual perspective, as part of your spiritual journey, or are you spiritual at all? That's the question.
Interesting. Wow.
a bit away from the financial things, but yeah.
I would say I'm medium spiritual.
Okay.
I would consider myself spiritual, yes, but Paraguay is not part of that journey. For me, I had a phase where I read not a lot, but a couple of very spiritual books. And I liked it, but I realized that you need to find something for yourself, which works for you as an individual. And like 10 people around you can say, oh, this religion is great, or spirituality, or the universe and things. But if it doesn't resonate with you, it doesn't help you. So I realized that for me, just living a good life, like being surrounded by nice people and getting ahead in life and traveling, that's for me kind of my spirituality. I don't have a super high bar for that. I'm not looking for enlightenment or something. But actually thinking about that, the people you meet while traveling are so fascinating. Some are not, but a lot of them, or some are really fascinating and from different backgrounds, and like, I think that is pretty spiritual. Because I think if you do something and you have a good feeling about it, and you learn and you laugh or something, that's my goal. Not being the next Dalai Lama.
Yeah. Of course.
But I think when I talk to people who are very spiritual, like my wife, for example, I think there are places on earth that are more spiritual than here. Like we've been to Egypt, to the tombs, for example, which is obviously a very spiritual place. But then I think, I guarantee you, these Guaranis, these indigenous people, the natives here, I guarantee you they have a very rich culture. I don't know about it, but it's such an old culture. They probably have health-wise and spiritually, there's probably very interesting stuff to be learned. So maybe that's something we learn more about in the future.
Yeah, if you tune into the podcast, maybe an episode, maybe who knows? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for coming, Tom. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
And what kind of question would you like to leave for a next guest, without knowing who they are? just anything.
Maybe we didn't talk about that today, which is fine. But maybe something like, what frustrates you most about Paraguay and the Paraguayan people, or not Paraguayan people, but like Paraguayan way of doing things.
Yeah, I should have asked that
because
question.
we have to be honest, right? You go to a completely different country, and yes, it helps that Paraguayan is Christian, and that makes me I can assimilate here much easier than I could in Egypt, for example. Egypt was beautiful and people were really nice to us, but it's super different culture, and here it's much easier. But yeah, there are a lot of things that frustrate me.
I mean, what frustrates you, for instance? I mean,
Well, I'm German, so
right.
So if you have an appointment, like a technician is coming at 2, and you're canceling plans, and nobody comes for the next 2 days, that's frustrating. It's not terrible. It's good for a good learning experience for me. But yeah, that's something that frustrates me.
So when it comes to reliability in general, or the weight of their word, whether they keep it or not, or
I just think it's a very different culture that I can't understand. I have zero understanding why someone would say I'm going to be there at 2 and then he doesn't arrive at all. That doesn't really my brain doesn't work like that. Because I think it's okay, but then you just say one text.
Yeah, that's sorry, I can't go.
But it's good for me, because I'm very extreme German in that, and it's so we laugh about it now, because when we get a notification the technician is coming at 2, we just look at each other and think, of course, sure. He'll come next month.
Yeah, but
it's fun.
Yeah, but if they actually come, I mean, the surprise you get, the excitement, like, oh my God, they actually made it today.
Exactly. Yeah. That was one question, right?
So, Tom, thank you very much again, and we might repeat for another episode if you're interested.
Anytime. I support your project.
Thank you. We have reached the end. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. If you want the best tools out there when it comes to living abroad, be it traveling or actually settling down in a specific country, we have put together a free living abroad toolbox with all the services you need, from banking all the way to eSIMs, to make your life abroad much less stressful and chaotic, the way it should be. Also, if you like the content that we are doing on this channel, please consider subscribing, hit the bell icon, hit the like button if you like what you've seen. And if you want to check out our next episode, you can go right here. So check it out.